They told me walking wouldn't make a difference, that at 70 I should take it easy. But the first morning I put on my shoes, I didn't realize I was walking away from the old version of me and towards something I never thought I'd feel again. Narration continues, soft, heartfelt tone. It started on a cold March morning. Not the kind of cold that bites your skin, but the kind that seeps into your bones. I remember standing by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the bare branches. The house was quiet, too quiet, and inside, I felt like I was fading. That day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I laced up my old sneakers, the ones still dusty from when my husband and I used to walk down by the lake. He's gone now, has been for a while. But something inside me said, just try. So I did. No fancy workout plan. No doctor's orders. Just one foot in front of the other. Down the driveway, past a mailbox and out onto the sidewalk where spring hadn't quite arrived yet. But hope, maybe it had. I wasn't walking fast. In fact, I was barely moving at all. My legs ached. My back protested. But as I moved forward, even slowly, I noticed something strange. I felt alive. Not better. Not stronger. Just present. More than I had felt in years. I didn't know it then, but that 15-minute walk was about to set off a chain of events that would shock even my own doctor. And that was just day one. Before that morning walk, most of my days blended into each other like an old faded photograph. Quiet, slow, and a little blurry around the edges. I'd wake up around 6 a.m., not because I was excited to greet the day, but because I had nothing left to dream about. The radio would hum in the background, a pot of coffee would simmer on the counter, and I'd sit in the same chair by the window, watching the street outside, feeling more like a ghost than a person still alive. My knees hurt when I stood up, my back grown like an old tree, and more often than not, I skipped breakfast simply because I didn't feel hungry for anything. Not food, not conversation, not even purpose. It's strange how quickly stillness can turn into heaviness, how silence can become a kind of noise in your chest. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I was the drift, the kind of drifting that doesn't feel like floating, but more like sinking slowly, without anyone noticing. There were days when I forget what day it was entirely, not because of age or memory, but because nothing felt different enough to be remembered. The hours stretched long, and sometimes the only voice I'd hear was the one coming from the television, trying to sell me pills for problems I wasn't even sure I had. When you reach a certain age, people stop asking you what your dreams are. They assume you've either done it all or given up. And maybe I had, in some quiet way I didn't even recognize. My world had become smaller, just the house, the mailbox, the same groceries, the same sounds. But deep down, I think a part of me still remembered how it used to feel to wake up with a sense of movement, with the idea that something new might still be waiting for me out there. That part of me, buried beneath the ache in my joints and the weight of loss, had quietly hoped that I'd do something about it. I didn't need a miracle. I just needed a reason. And somehow, without planning or drama, that reason came in the shape of a simple walk. The second day, I walked a little farther, not by much, just to the edge of the park at the end of my street. The bench under the oak tree was still damp from morning dew, but I sat anyway, watching a squirrel dart between fallen leaves and listening to the wind rustle through the branches like whispers from another life. My legs were sore, and I could feel every joint reminding me of my age, but beneath that ache, there was something else, something new, or maybe something very old that I'd almost forgotten. A flicker of pride. It wasn't the kind of pride you shout about or post on the internet. It was quieter than that. It was a pride of doing something for yourself when no one's watching, of proving to your own body that it's still capable of moving, still capable of showing up. I didn't need applause. I just needed to feel that I hadn't given up on myself. The days that followed weren't easy. There were mornings when I almost talked myself out of it, when my knees felt stiff or the sky looked too gray, or the excuses came knocking louder than the will to keep going. But there was something about that little ritual, putting on my shoes, stepping outside, feeling the air on my face, that began to stitch my days together in a way I hadn't felt in years. I began to notice things I had long stopped seeing. The way the sun filtered through tree branches in the early morning, how the neighborhood cats always sat in the same spot near the red brick wall, How people I know started to nod or smile as we pass each other. It's funny how movement, even slow and simple, can stir parts of the heart that have been still for too long. I wasn't walking for weight loss, or for blood pressure, or because someone told me I had to. I was walking because it made me feel like I was part of something again, part of the rhythm of the world, not just a quiet observer of it. And the most surprising part, I began to sleep better. The tossing and turning that had followed me like a shadow for years began to fade. I'd fall asleep without needing to count sheep or chase melatonin. For the first time in ages, I wasn't waking up tired. I was waking up curious, wondering how far I might walk today, and what small beauty I might find along the way. About 2 weeks in, something strange began to happen. Not all at once, not in some grand dramatic way, but in tiny, almost imperceptible shifts that added up quietly, like morning light filling a room you didn't realize had gone dark. One morning, as I reached the top of the small hill near the park, something that used to leave me breathless, I noticed I wasn't panting. I wasn't leaning over, gripping my knees, waiting for the tightness in my chest to ease. Instead, I stood there calmly, looking out over the neighborhood rooftops, breathing an air that somehow tasted crisper, cleaner, more alive. I smiled, not a forced smile for someone else's benefit, but the kind that comes naturally from somewhere deep inside that's been asleep far too long. The swelling in my ankles had lessened. I didn't notice it right away. It was only when I slipped on my socks without wincing that I realized something had changed. My hands, which had often trembled slightly when pouring coffee, had steadied. My digestion improved. I was no longer skipping meals because I wasn't hungry. In fact, I had started craving real food, fresh fruit, eggs, warm oatmeal, not out of duty, but because my body finally felt like it wanted to be nourished. I had a doctor's appointment scheduled for the end of the month. I almost canceled it. I figured, what's the point? It'll be the same old routine, prescriptions, polite concern, a reminder to stay active. But I went anyway. Habit, I suppose. Or maybe curiosity. The nurse raised an eyebrow when she took my blood pressure. That's lower than last time, she said. The number surprised even her. When my doctor came in and reviewed my chart, he blinked twice and asked if I'd changed my medication. I hadn't. I told him I'd simply started walking every morning. 15 minutes, maybe 20 on good days. He looked at me for a moment, then smiled, the kind of smile doctors don't often show. Keep going, he said. You're doing something right. That night, I walked again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And as I passed a lamplight near my street and felt the cool evening air against my skin, I realized something even more important than improved numbers or steadier hands. I felt proud of myself in a way I hadn't felt in decades. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live. By the 4th week, the walks had become more the routine. They were a lifeline, a soft thread pulling me back into a world I thought had quietly closed its doors on me. It wasn't just about my knees hurting less or sleeping more soundly. It was about how I had begun to recognize the people and places around me, and how, to my quiet surprise, they had begun to recognize me too. There was a young woman with a golden retriever who passed me every morning near the school crosswalk. The first few days, she nodded politely. A week later, she smiled. Then one morning, she slowed her pace just enough to say, "You've got a great walking rhythm. You keep me moving." That comment, so simple, echoed in my chest longer than it should have, as if some part of me had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed, not for my age or fragility, but for something strong. I started to see the same older man tending his garden around the same time each day. At first, we exchanged those guarded glances all strangers do, but slowly, over days and nods and little weather-related chuckles, a kind of friendship began to bloom between us. He handed me a small bag of tomatoes once, just said, "These are sweeter than they look," and went back to trimming his roses. I carried those tomatoes like they were a gift from the universe. Even the birds seemed more familiar. I knew where the robins nested. I knew which tree the mourning doves favored, and I could tell when a new song filled the air. It's strange, isn't it? How we can live somewhere for years and never really see it until we begin to move through it slowly, intentionally, with a heart open enough to notice the small things. And the truth is, I began to feel less alone. Not because I suddenly had dozens of friends or invitations filling my mailbox, but because the world around me had stopped feeling distant. I was no longer a forgotten old woman behind a window. I was someone who existed in the rhythm of the day, who passed a mailman, waved to kids on bicycles, exchanged glances with a barista sweeping the sidewalk in front of the cafe. And with every step, I started to feel like I belonged again, not to someone else, not to a role or a title I once held, but to myself and to the present moment. It had been nearly 6 weeks since that first hesitant walk, and by then I had stopped counting the minutes. Some days I walked longer, some days slower, but the clock no longer mattered. What mattered was that I kept showing up for myself, for my body, for a life I thought had quietly wound down long ago. I didn't expect miracles, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. I could feel it, not just in my joints or my breath, but in the way I looked at my own reflection each morning, no longer avoiding the mirror like it held only decay and time, but greeting it like a familiar friend returning from a long trip. So when I walked into the clinic for my quarterly checkup, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't expecting anything big. I didn't need good news to feel proud. I had already claimed something back, something no blood test could measure. But when the nurse wrapped the cuff around my arm, she paused. "That's lower," she said, eyebrows lifted, her voice more curious than concerned. I shrugged. "Is that good or bad?" She smiled. "Very good." Next came the blood work, then the weigh-in, then the conversation with Dr. Patel, who had been my physician for almost a decade. Kind, smart, a man of few words and many charts. He scrolled through his tablet, tapping and swiping, his brows furrowing just slightly. "Your cholesterol is down. Your blood pressure is well within range. Your resting heart rate is lower than it's been in years," he said, not quite looking at me yet. I waited. Then he glanced up, one corner of his mouth lifting in that rare, almost parental kind of smile. "You've done something," he said. I nodded, just started walking. He leaned back, arms crossed, genuinely impressed. 15 minutes a day? Most days, yes. He shook his head gently, the kind of shake that says he's seen many patients ignore advice far more urgent than mine. I wish more people would believe in the power of something so simple. But it wasn't just the data that struck me. It was the way he looked at me, not as a patient to be managed or an elderly woman ticking off appointments. He looked at me like someone who had decided to fight, quietly, consistently, not against death, but for life. And I realized then, as I walked out of that building into the fading light of the spring afternoon, that this wasn't just about numbers or charts. This was about reclaiming dignity, about writing a new chapter without needing permission, about proving that even in the later pages of a life story, there's still room for something unexpected, something beautiful. By the 7th week, I had stopped thinking of walking as exercise. It had become something else entirely, a kind of moving meditation, a ritual return, not just to the neighborhood streets or the sound of my own breath, but to the parts of me I'd slowly tucked away over the years without even realizing. I hadn't known how much of myself I'd lost to stillness, not the dramatic kind of loss that comes with grief or trauma, but the subtle erosion that happens when the world stops asking you questions, when no one expects you to try new things, when birthdays come and go with fewer candles, fewer voices, and fewer plans. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling alive. Not because I was dying, but because I'd quietly convinced myself that my best chapters were already written. But something had changed. Something was changing. I noticed I was humming again while making coffee. I caught myself looking forward to tomorrow. I stood taller in the mirror. I started wearing lipstick again, not for anyone else, but because I remembered I used to love how it made me feel like myself. I began keeping a little journal on the kitchen counter. Nothing fancy, just a cheap spiral notebook where I jotted down small things. What the sky looked like that morning, a new flower I saw blooming near the church fence, the sound of the wind chimes at the neighbor's porch. These weren't diary entries. They were affirmations of presence, proof that I was still here, still paying attention. And maybe that was the most important shift of all. not the lower blood pressure or steadier legs, but the realization that I had slowly started caring again, not just about health, but about living deeply, truthfully, even quietly. I wasn't chasing some big goal or transformation. I didn't need to run marathons or reverse the clock. I just wanted to be present in my own life again. And somehow, 15 minutes a day had handed that back to me. Not in fireworks or applause, but in the soft, steady way that sunrise returns after a long night, asking for nothing but your attention. If you had told me a year ago that 15 minutes a day could change my life, I would have smiled politely and gone back to folding laundry or watching news with the volume turned too low. I didn't need convincing back then. I needed connection. I needed someone to remind me that even small choices have power, that even late chapters can still surprise us with new meaning. Now, as I look back on the past few months, I don't see a fitness plan or success story. I see a quiet kind of awakening. I see the woman who took her first shaky step down the driveway and the one who now walks with her head high and eyes wide open. They're the same person, but the second one remembers how it feels to be here. Really here. You don't have to run marathons to feel alive. You don't need fancy shoes or perfect health. You just need a moment, your moment, a choice to step outside, breathe in the air, and tell yourself, I'm not done yet. So if you're listening and you've been sitting in that same chair by the window, if you've been wondering whether it's too late to begin again, whether your story still has something left to say, I want you to know it absolutely does. 15 minutes. That's all it took. 15 quiet minutes a day. And somehow, without me even noticing, they became a bridge, one that carried me from stillness to movement, from fading to becoming, from loneliness back to life. And if it could happen for me, it can happen for you, too. One step at a time. One morning at a time. You don't need a plan. You just need to begin.